The Life of King Alfred was a biography of Alfred the Great, written by a Welsh monk named Asa, who knew the king personally. It's a wonderful insight into one of history's greatest rulers, and a vitally important source for Alfred's reign. Another famous source for the events of Alfred's reign is, of course, the Anglo Saxon Chronicles, which was compiled on Alfred's orders and continued centuries after Alfred's death in 899. There are other later sources as well. As you look through all these materials, one thing will jump out at you after a while. That is the impression you get of what a truly great man and king Alfred truly must have been. That may sound like a fairly obvious statement to make, considering he is known to history as Alfred the Great. But what has to be established is, why was Alfred so great? There are several reasons for Alfred's greatness, and those will become, hopefully, more obvious as we journey through Alfred's approximately 50-year-long life. Born in Wantage, Berkshire in 849, Alfred's father was King Athelwulf of Wessex. Athelwulf surrounded himself with men who had good judgment and some courage as well, and it was a good job he did too. Athelwulf's reign coincided with an increase in severity and frequency of Viking raids. During Alfred's childhood, Athelwulf sent him on two occasions to Rome to visit the Pope, once accompanied by a retinue of Anglo Saxon nobles, and on the second occasion, Alfred was taken by Athelwulf himself. Obviously, such trips would leave a lasting impression on Alfred. Alfred's mother was Osber. Osber took a keen interest in her children's learning, and Asa tells how, one day, Osber told her children that whichever of them could memorize a book of Saxon poems, then that child could keep the book. Although still unable to read, young Alfred eagerly took the book from his mother's hand and took it instead to his tutor, who he asked to read the poems out loud, whilst Alfred listened intently and focused with all his might to remember the words, and apparently he was successful. Alfred was described as being extraordinarily beloved by both his mother and his father, and it must have been a very sad blow for the young boy when both of them died before he had even turned 10. Nonetheless, both Athelwulf and Osber had reared a very intelligent son, who would love learning for the rest of his life, and as king, Alfred would bemoan the lack of good tutors across Wessex. Alfred would do his best to remedy that, and he tried to ensure that children from all classes had access to a decent education, believing that an educated society could only be beneficial to his kingdom. It was whilst returning from the second trip to Rome that Alfred got a new stepmother. Athelwulf and his company had stopped off at the court of Charles the Bald, the Frankish king, where the King of Wessex met Charles's daughter Judith. With Osbert dead, Athelwulf took Judith back to Wessex to be his new queen. After Athelwulf's death in 858, Judith was scandalously married to Athelbald, Alfred's brother, who had rebelled against Athelwulf whilst Athelwulf had been away on the continent. Athelbald's marriage to Judith and reign as sole ruler of Wessex, having forced his father to divide the kingdom, was short lived and was, according to Asa, 2.5 years of lawlessness. Following the death of Athelbald, another two of Alfred's brothers succeeded as kings of Wessex. The first of these was Athelbert, who the Anglo Saxon Chronicles says ruled Wessex in good concord, and who, Asa says, ruled his kingdom in peace, love, and honour. Quite how true these statements are is up for debate. Both Asa and the Anglo Saxon Chronicles also describes how the Vikings raided and sacked Winchester during Ethelbert's reign, before an army of men from Berkshire hunted the raiders down and defeated them in battle, which is an indication that the Viking threat was never too far away. However, it may be that a period of relative calm followed the sack of Winchester, and Ethelbert was indeed allowed to rule in a climate of reasonable quiet. After Ethelbert's death in 865, Ethelred I came to the throne of Wessex. He was Alfred's last surviving brother, of which he had four, although a sister, Athelswith, lived and had married King Burgred of Mercia. Athelred tried to resist the Vikings as determinedly as he could, suffering both setbacks and some successes during his reign. Alfred, now becoming a young man, joined his brother on his campaigns and began to learn the arts of war and kingship in the 9th century. When Athelred died in 871, Alfred was ready to become a king. Athelred did have two young sons, who, in a later era, may well have succeeded their father as king, but given they were little more than infants at the time of their father's passing, there was no question of having a child ruler in the age of the Viking Wars. It was entirely impractical, especially when Alfred was now a fully grown man and experienced in battle. So it was Alfred who took the crown. In the months leading up to Alfred becoming king, the men of Wessex suffered harrowing defeats at Reading, Basing, and Merton, albeit with a success at the Battle of Ashdown thrown in. Alfred had been present at all these battles, and he would have learned some very harsh lessons indeed. Almost disregarding previous setbacks and afflicted by depleted numbers caused by several battles fought in a short space of time, the new king continued to carry the fight to the Vikings. At the Battle of Wilston, still in 871, Alfred and his small number of men fought courageously against the invaders, but were eventually overwhelmed. A few years before becoming king in 868, Alfred had married a woman named Ilswith, who was the daughter of a Mercian nobleman. Alfred would be married to Ilswith for over 30 years, until his death in 899, and when he became king in 871, Ilswith had already given him a daughter named Athelfled, who would lead a quite remarkable life. More children would follow in the years to come, including Alfred's successor, Edward the Elder. In 874, the Vikings drove out King Burgred of Mercia, husband of Alfred's sister Athelswith, who both fled to Rome. This must have enraged Alfred and also created a heightened sense of fear that his own kingdom was becoming increasingly vulnerable. Still, Alfred was not to be cowed. In 875, he fought fire with fire. The Vikings were, of course, highly experienced seafarers, but Alfred defeated them at their own game, as the Anglo Saxon Chronicles describes. And that summer of 875, King Alfred went out to sea with a raiding ship army and fought against 7 shiploads and captured one of them and put the others to flight. Whilst this particular incident may not look overly important, after all, most of the Viking ships escaped relatively unscathed, Alfred had nonetheless fired a shot across the bows and sent a clear message to the raiders that he was not afraid to attack, even at sea, where the Vikings would have felt to have held supremacy. Whilst on the surface, it in fact looks like a fairly minor incident, for the Vikings it would have been a bit of a jolt. Over the next couple of years, Alfred forced treaties out of the raiders and took hostages, but predictably, the Vikings soon broke the promises that they had made, and Alfred was left to pursue them. But by 878, Alfred was facing real difficulties, as the raiders breached his kingdom of Wessex and forced even the king himself to flee into the marshes and woodlands of Somerset. It was during these dark days that the most famous incident of Alfred's reign allegedly occurred. Seeking shelter from his enemies, Alfred was taken in by the wife of a swineherd. The peasant woman asked Alfred to watch the cakes that she was baking while she was preoccupied with other tasks. Obviously, with a lot on his mind, the distracted king let the cakes burn and had to face the wrath of an angry peasant woman. Perhaps such an experience inspired Alfred to greater heights. He renewed his efforts against the Vikings, with Asa saying, "After Easter, King Alfred, with a few men, made a stronghold in a place called Athelney, and from thence sallied with his vassals of Somerset to make frequent and unwearied assaults upon the heathen. And at the Battle of Edington, during that same year, he won a famous victory over Guthrum, the Danish king of East Anglia. 3 weeks after the battle, Guthrum and 30 of his most prominent men came to Alfred and were baptized as Christians. Not long after, Guthrum's forces retreated to Cirencester and eventually back to East Anglia. Alfred and Wessex had been extremely hard pressed by the Vikings and were perhaps teetering on the brink of a disastrous defeat, but the courage and martial brilliance of Alfred and his men had prevailed at Edington and had driven the invaders back. The victory at Edington preserved the kingdom of Wessex for Alfred and his successors to build upon. It is surely one of the most important battles in all English history. That is not to say there was suddenly universal peace for Alfred and his subjects. In 882, Alfred again took to sea, capturing 4 Viking ships, as well as killing a number of the ship's occupants. The following year, Alfred received a piece of the supposed true cross from Pope Marinus I in what was recognition for Alfred's tireless efforts against the Vikings, a heathen army that were plaguing not only the Anglo Saxon kingdoms, but other Christian parts of Europe as well. I have made this point elsewhere that it's not an exaggeration to say that Alfred the Great can almost be regarded as a Crusader king. Traditionally, the Crusading era is dated from the onset of the First Crusade in the 1090s, but the nature of Alfred's Viking wars, his conversion of Guthrum, being rewarded with a piece of the supposed true cross, etc., shows the distinctly Christian nature of Alfred's struggles. In 884, Alfred relieved a siege at Rochester in Kent before his men enjoyed both success and defeat in East Anglia. Such was the fortunes of war. And in 886, Alfred made another valuable gain, taking London, which he granted back to his son in law, Athelred of Mercia, husband of Athelfled. By now, Alfred was in his late 30s. His adult life had been preoccupied with worries about the Vikings and protecting his lands and people. However, he also had another very different type of concern, this of a medical nature. According to Asa, Alfred, after extensive celebrations of his marriage in 868, began to suffer from pains that were, in Asa's words, instant and overwhelming and unknown to any physician. The pain was excruciating for Alfred, and he turned to prayer, hoping desperately that he would experience some relief. But even during times when the pain was not as bad, Alfred could never fully relax for fear the pain would come back and afflict him worse than ever. Whilst people then speculated on what ailment Alfred was being troubled by, it is generally agreed upon now that Alfred's affliction was Crohn's disease. However, Alfred's spirit was never broken by his troubles, as Asa describes. Alfred continued to carry on the government and to practice hunting in all its branches, to teach his goldsmiths and all his artificers, his falconers, hawkers, and dog keepers. He built houses, majestic and rich beyond all custom of his predecessors, after his own new designs, to recite the Saxon books, and especially to learn by heart Saxon poems, and to make others learn them as well. In 893, assisted by his now maturing son Edward, Alfred defeated the Vikings at Farnham and recaptured treasures that had been stolen by the invaders. Alfred had split his army into two and entrusted one half to the leadership of Edward. Whilst Edward showed his youth during a slightly reckless charge in pursuit of the fleeing Danes, while still separated from his father's part of the army, it was clear that Alfred's heir had learned much under his father's tutelage, which would stand him in good stead for his own magnificent reign when the time came. In 896, Alfred again showed his ingenuity by mimicking the Viking example. He ordered longships to be built, which he put to good use and again inflicted significant damage on the enemy at sea. But there were some things that Alfred's brilliance could not control. In the late 890s, the Anglo Saxons were afflicted with regular pestilence, leading to widespread death among livestock and humans alike, including some of the king's key supporters. In 899, Alfred himself died, a warrior king to the very end. But it wasn't just his exploits in war that Alfred was renowned for. In the words of Asa, Alfred showed himself to be a minute investigator of the truth in all his judgments, and this especially for the sake of the poor, to whose interest, day and night, among other duties of this life, Alfred was ever wonderfully attentive. The king encouraged schooling for all classes and ordered translation of books so they could be read by a wider audience. And, of course, the Anglo Saxon Chronicles remains one of the most valuable sources for not only Alfred's time, but for the centuries both immediately before and after his reign. But one cannot escape what Alfred's reign was dominated by: the Viking Wars. Alfred, in the grips of a brutal, decades long, debilitating illness, relentlessly defied the odds and gained ground, and, as so frequently stated in the Anglo Saxon Chronicles, he put the raiders to flight. Not long ago, a piece was written claiming Alfred the Great was not all that great. This is complete and utter nonsense. If anything, great doesn't begin to scratch the surface when it comes to Alfred's brilliance. He was a king like no other in English history, and in the decades to come, his son, daughter, and grandson would make full use of Alfred's hard work.